History of Role-Playing Games in 101 Objects, Chapter 5, Worlds, Stars and Heroes. We're going to look at two different things in this chapter. We're going to look at a whole different genre of role-playing game that we haven't covered before. I'll come to that shortly. But we're going to start off looking at what I call Worlds and Stars. And that's the idea of the detailed campaign setting as a published document, as an item that role-playing game publishers can put out there that people can buy and use for their own role-playing campaigns, whether they're using them to mix and match with their own existing campaign worlds, or whether they actually play in that specific campaign world. Up until the early 80s, this really hadn't been a thing, or not necessarily a popular thing in role-playing games. People had tended to make up their own campaign world, and very often they were sketchy campaign worlds. I suppose Empire of the Petal Throne, which we saw way back at the start of the series, would be an exception to that, but then that wasn't very successful. Other games, RuneQuest, I suppose, had its own campaign system, campaign setting. Other games sort of acquired them as they went along. But for Dungeons and Dragons, for example, the idea of a published campaign setting was quite unusual. There had been a World of Greyhawk, a couple of World of Greyhawk sets, but they're by modern standards of what we'd expect in a published campaign setting, they're very flimsy on detail. Possibly the first, or one of the first worlds to be really detailed in terms of having lots of supplements written about it, not surprisingly, would be Middle-earth. After all, probably the most famous fantasy campaign setting. Iron Crown Enterprises, ICE, had the license to it, so they produced a series of supplements for their, initially for Rolemaster, their Rolemaster RPG, and later they essentially made a Rolemaster Lite and called it Middle-earth Role-Playing, which we now know as MERP. So here's Object 34 of our 101 objects. This is a typical MERP supplement. This is Ents of Fangorn. There's a lot of these. They're very popular. This one's in really quite nice condition. Hold a good value today. Fantastic supplements. You know, even if you're not using the rule system, there's a lot of material here if you want to role play in Fangorn Forest. Let's see what you get. First of all, nice cover art by Angus McBride. You know, rather more professional looking. A lot of stuff released at the time. This was actually released in 1987. This one. Not by any means the first. It's quite small print. Nice interior artwork. This one, a lot of interior artwork in MERP stuff is by Liz Danforth, who I think is an excellent fantasy artist. Also editor of Tunnels of Trolls, which we've seen earlier. Lots of details on individuals that you might meet. Obviously, Ents in Fangorn Forest. Some truly fantastic fantasy cartography. I'm a bit of a fantasy cartographer myself. You know, I like making fantasy maps. And the guy who does them for MERP is a guy called, I think, Peter Fenlon. And he's a huge influence on my style. I think his stuff is fantastic. So I'm going to give you, here's the centre spread. You pull out these maps of Fangorn Forest. Look at isn't that great? Fantastic stuff. You didn't really get anything like this in earlier material. And you get a lot of stuff. It seems like a fairly thin booklet. Actually, there's a lot of detail, small print, a lot packed into each of these, and there's a lot of them. And ICE actually go as far as to release supplements for areas of Middle-earth that Tolkien didn't cover, or even for those that he did cover, like Fangorn Forest. You get a lot more detail than you would ever get just by reading a couple of chapters of The Lord of the Rings. If you're role-playing in that setting, you need it. ICE's stuff covering outside of Tolkien's coverage, so in the south of Middle-earth or in the east of Middle-earth, is possibly, for my tastes, strays a little bit sometimes away from what I think Tolkien would have written. But again, that's very subjective. I call this bit Worlds, Stars and Heroes. The Stars is talking about science fiction role-playing game, which at the time, clearly the most popular science fiction role-playing game is Traveller. And Traveller started out in the 70s without a detailed campaign setting. The original 3 little black books didn't have an actual setting. But over years, as GDW released their own supplements and their articles in their house magazine Journal of the Tribal Aid Society, a campaign setting's beginning to be built up, which has a sort of large human interstellar empire in the middle called the Third Imperium, and then there are various other interstellar states outside that that are either alien or different kinds of humans. And the clever idea that they have a GDW, realizing actually, it's probably more than a small company can cope with, detailing a very, a sizable chunk of the galaxy, is to license out individual sectors of the Traveller map to third-party publishers. So we've got one of these sectors here. This is Vanguard Reaches sector by Paranoia Press. Not a big company by any means. What do you get? You get, I'll take there's a map, I'll come to that later. A fairly lightweight cover. Lots and lots of tables of world statistics with a few little descriptions. That's the kind of thing you can show to people, I think, who don't know Traveller, and they think, oh my god, that looks really, really daunting. But if you play Traveller, you end up sort of knowing what, for example, the world of Koos, which is the subsector capital, its code of A9A6646-D actually means. Off the top of my head, got a size Class A starport, which is a very big starport. It's size 9, so that's a big world. That's atmosphere type A, I think. Hydrographic 6, so about 60% of the world is covered by water. Population 6B millions, I think. Government type 4, law level 6, and tech level D. It's been a while. I think that was mostly right. It might be. I can't remember what the tech level and what that government type is. And I think the population might be out either way. You also get this sector map. I'm calling this Object 35, by the way. There is a map of the Vanguard Reaches sector. And yes, it's just a lot of lines. Space, it's just a lot of lines. So there's lots of these. Produced by third-party publishers. Judges Guild, who we covered before, people behind things like City State of the Invincible Overlord, they get, I think, 4 sectors. FASA, long time before they were doing Shadowrun and a long time before they were doing Battletech, were doing Traveller stuff. And each, detailing different parts of what Traveller calls charted space, which is a particular little part of the galaxy. And I think that's a really clever way to do it. I can't think of another company, another role-playing game where there have been particular designated areas of the campaign setting for other companies to sort of deal with. I think that's a really good way of doing it. It means that you can create, subplots, characters, adventures, all tied in together. FASA and Game Lord, which is sort of successor to FASA in a way, and Traveller, did that very well. Now, there's no reason why a published detailed campaign setting has to be specific to one role-playing game, of course. So one of the very first sort of system-free campaign settings is Harn, produced by Columbia Games. Still going strong, Harn. Very, very, very detailed fantasy setting, which tries very hard to be as realistic as a fantasy setting with some magic could be. Takes a technology and society level from roughly 11th century Western-ish Europe, sort of Norman conquest kind of era, and goes into a lot of detail. You can spend a lot of money on Harn, detailing, going into quite some detail. Personally, I think the way to use Harn is to take bits of it and put them into your own campaign setting. Now, we've got an example here. This is actually this is going to be object number 36. This is one kingdom of Rethem. A lot of Harn stuff comes in loose leaf, where you stick it into folders. So here we've got. I'll turn around and show you that a map of the kingdom of Rethem. It's a rather modern styled map. I prefer my fantasy maps to be a bit old-fashioned, but that's probably more usable. There's the old-fashioned map on the back, actually. And then you get a lot of detail about geography and history of the Kingdom of Retham. You'll get current events, religion in Retham, culture, food and drink, crime and punishment, government, major NPCs, how it's organised, what the military resources are, and so on. That's a hell of a lot of detail for just not the whole campaign setting by any means. This is a single country. The way I think you use Harn, as I say, is to drop stuff into your campaign setting. I imagine lots of people over the years have created their own fantasy campaign world. I bet very few people have spent that much time detailing the minutiae, like social customs and religion for individual countries. So if you've got a campaign setting, well, I think the way to do it is to take the, scribble out Retham, and this is the kingdom of whateverania in your campaign world, and change what you want to and keep what you like. Now, TSR at the time, we mentioned D&D, TSR at this time is also coming to the conclusion that we could make money by selling campaign settings. This is towards the end of first edition AD&D's time. It's sort of got a campaign, it's sort of got two campaign settings, I suppose. Well, arguably it's got four. Arguably five, actually, at the moment, but none of them are really what you'd call developed. First of all, we've got Greyhawk, which is sort of the default AD&D setting, and sort of works as a background for dungeon crawl adventures, but has had the odd boxed set about it, but not any level of detail really, and it's very, very sword and sorcery and pulpy. Not at all suitable if you want to do rather more highfalutin epic fantasy, or if you want to have political machinations, I don't think. Then there's the known world, which is the world detailed in the basic and expert and companion, etc. D&D sets. Came to be called Mystara later on rather than known world. I really like Mystara, but we haven't quite got to the stage where it's getting a lot of published support for it. That comes later. Then there's Dragonlance, which is quite a detailed setting, but at the moment is mostly detailed through adventures. During first edition, there's one small source book. For the most part, Dragonlance gets detailed as a campaign setting later. For first edition, it's mostly assumed that you will be playing through the Dragonlance campaign as set out in the DL series of adventures. So that's the third one. The fourth one, I suppose you could call it a separate campaign setting, in as much as we've had two Ravenloft adventures, but it hasn't been developed as a campaign setting yet. In fact, most of the AD&D adventures published at this time are published without an actual campaign setting attached to them. You just drop them in wherever you want to. The really obscure fifth official TSR first edition AD&D campaign setting that people tend to forget is Pellinor, which was the campaign setting detailed in TSR UK's Imagine magazine. And because it was published by TSR, even if it was TSR UK, I think that counts as an official TSR campaign setting. People tend to forget it. Anyway, none of these were really ideal to do what TSR wanted, which is to have a sort of fairly generic campaign setting that would suit all sort of styles of play, and you could drop all the standard player's handbook and Unearthed Arcana, for that matter, character races and monsters in the monster manual and character classes into it. Dragonlance wasn't that, because it had a lot of races weren't there, and even some character classes weren't there. So Dragonlance was sort of a bit different. And what they ended up with was Ed Greenwood's Forgotten Realms. Now, Ed Greenwood was not a TSR staffer. He'd been developing Forgotten Realms for his own purposes for many, many years, rather like Professor Tolkien did Middle-earth originally for his own purposes, rather like Mohammed Rahman did Tekimel for his own purposes. Ed Greenwood had Forgotten Realms. And TSR acquired Forgotten Realms, and Edward Greenwood came on board to write some supplements for it. And at the same time, they produced novels for it, started producing adventures, and also individual supplements which would detail a particular area or particular country of the Forgotten Realms. And I think these are great. His Object 37 is the original first edition of Forgotten Realms campaign setting boxed set. Really nice box set at the time. And there was a lot of excitement about Forgotten Realms. I remember getting into Forgotten Realms quite a bit at the time. I read somewhere that they actually only paid Ed Greenwood $5,000 to use Forgotten Realms. And when you think, if that's true, when you think that Forgotten Realms essentially was the default campaign setting for the end of first edition, for second edition, for third edition, for fourth edition, and is pretty much the only campaign setting for fifth edition, give or take Ravenloft and so on. Actually, no, it's not fair. They are producing new campaign settings now for fifth, but it's still the default for fifth edition. There's a lot of stuff over the years being produced for under Forgotten Realms. So people think of it now as, I think, as the default D&D campaign setting. There is a tendency nowadays, I think, to think of it as a very much bog standard Fantasyland generic fantasy campaign setting, and I think that's a little unfair. I think the reason you get that is that in 5th edition, published adventures for 5th edition have largely concentrated on the area known as the Sword Coast, which is quite, which is a sort of very generic Fantasyland, Western Europe, medieval sort of setting. Although I think, in common with many fantasy campaign settings, has a tendency, Wizards of the Coast, to throw everything in just because. As it started, if you look back at first edition and second edition Forgotten Realms, there's a lot more diverse environments and diverse cultures, detailed. They're still there in 5th edition, it's just that nobody's haven't gone to them, with the exception of Tomb of Annihilation, which was set down in Hult. I don't know if that's how you pronounce it. It's written Chult. I'm not sure on Forgotten Realms pronunciations. Chult. Cult. I'm from Wales, so I'm going to pronounce it Hult. Actually, if it's Welsh, I suppose it might be Hilt, but nobody's going to pronounce it like that. So let's go with Hult. Hult. A cult actually is not a European sort of setting. It's a sort of Lost World, jungle-y kind of setting. And original Forgotten Realms has all these different environments. There's a great glacier. There's Anarok, the great desert, which is dry. There are sort of empires of the sands, hot, exotic locations down south, and in the Far East you've got Karatur, which comes later. That's essentially the Oriental adventure setting. In between the main Forgotten Realms part and Karatur, you've got huge, wide open steppes where you've got Mongol type warriors. Across the Western Ocean, you've got Maztica, that comes later. That's a sort of Central and South American setting. You've got the Moonshae Islands, which are very much a fantasy Celtic kind of setting. So there's all sorts of different stuff in Forgotten Realms. Arguably, you could say that's a downside, that it isn't thematically coherent in the way that some campaign settings, like, say, Dark Sun, are. But actually, I quite like having a diversity. In the end, Mystara, Known World, gets a similar release of supplements, and again, that has lots of different cultures and lots of different environments. So I quite like that. The other thing I'm going to mention, actually, at this point, as well as having, we've looked at different the detailed campaign setting. This is also around about the time when you get coming to the forefront, the idea of a campaign setting neutral rule system that you can use for any genre. Now, Chaos Humor, of course, had done this with basic role playing, but never really pushed it as a rule system in its own right. It was always that, Call of Cthulhu, which you bought as a single game, used the same system as RuneQuest, which used the same system as Stormbringer, which used the same system as ElfQuest, and so on. Steve Jackson Games goes the other way and releases GURPS. It's a 3rd edition. This is Object 38. It's a 3rd edition GURPS rulebook, hardback, generic universal role-playing system. And GURPS was a rule system that you could use with any genre. And as well as the rulebook, you then bought genre supplements for whatever you wanted to play. And there were dozens and dozens of these supplements, many written by quite famous people. Jo Walton, famous fantasy author, she wrote a few of those, or co-wrote a few of those. So if you want to play a role-playing game set in the years before the Battle of Waterloo, well, you buy GURPS and Napoleon. If your favourite science fiction novel series is Jack Vance's Planet of Adventure series, bit obscure, quite influential on Traveller, what you buy, GURPS, Planet of Adventure. And if you're thinking that's quite obscure, well, yeah, it was quite obscure, but there are so many of these GURPS supplements that they cover quite a lot of quite obscure published settings and quite obscure time periods. For many years, actually, GURPS World War II was probably the best World War II RPG out there. GURPS has a reputation for being very crunchy, and it is. It's probably not a modern role-playing game in that sense. It's certainly not rules light. But also, once you've learned the basic system, it is true that you can adapt it to pretty much everything. And there are so many genres touched by GURPS. And also GURPS you find used on existing RPGs. So, for example, there is a very good GURPS Traveller game. I wouldn't use GURPS rules, personally, to play Traveller with, but the background material that they published for GURPS Traveller was excellent. Really, really excellent. So, GURPS, it's worth checking out. Right, we're going to move on to the final part of this chapter, which is the heroes part of Worlds, Stars and Heroes, and that's looking at superhero role-playing games, which we've not really looked at before. Cast yourself back to, again, we're in the mid-80s here. Then, as now, so the key intellectual property in superheroes would be Marvel Universe. Marvel decides that essentially they're going to auction off the rights to have a Marvel role-playing game. In the end, it seems like there are two major bidders, TSR and Games Workshop. And TSR won, basically. And they produced a game called Marvel Superheroes, which we've got here as Object 40. I've got these numbers all around, never mind. And Marvel Superheroes was quite commercially successful for TSR. Nothing on the scale of D&D, certainly, but it's probably one of their more successful role-playing games. Certainly way more successful than the likes of Gamma World or Boot Hill or Metamorphosis Alpha. Supported well. Lots of supplements, lots of adventures especially, box sets, articles in Dragon Magazine. It's still a popular game, still sort of highly regarded. The rule system is arguably a bit simple. I know some people don't like it because it isn't quite realistic enough. I think if you're playing a superhero game to be realistic, you're probably playing the wrong genre. But you know, a good RPG. Object 41. Here we go. This is Golden Heroes. Now, Golden Heroes is the Games Workshop entry, and Golden Heroes had Games Workshop won the auction, won the battle against TSR to get the Marvel license. Golden Heroes would have been plastered with Marvel logos and essentially would have been Marvel Heroes or whatever. I actually played Golden Heroes back in the time, and it's a lot of fun. Actually, it's a very bright and breezy kind of system, mechanically very sound, really fun character generation system. And this might have been a positive side effect of not winning the auction and not being tied to being a Marvel game. So, for the most part, you created your own superheroes and you rolled them up. You rolled up what your special abilities were. So, having rolled up your special abilities, you didn't have to decide, you have to work out what the background to your character is, how he got, he became Spider-Man because he was bitten by a radioactive spider, whatever the equivalent is that is. And that's a lot of fun in its own right, I think. I think if I was playing a superhero role-playing game now, I would want to do it with, my own characters or my players' own characters, not using Iron Man or Wolverine or whatever. Object 42, well, where there's a Marvel license, you would expect there to be a DC Heroes license, and there was, and Mayfair produced this role-playing game, DC Heroes. Again, quite popular, quite well supported, not to the extent that Marvel Superheroes was. For one thing, I think Mayfair not really having the same marketing oomph that TSR was able to have. But I've saved the best to last, arguably. It's Object 39. As I say, I've got these on my phone. And that's Champions. This is a third edition of the Champions rulebook. Champions are produced by a small company, or smallish at the time, called Hero Games. Didn't have an existing IP to base itself on. Didn't have a big company behind it to push it, like Marvel Superheroes or Golden Heroes. But somehow, Champions ends up essentially winning the race. and is probably was the most popular superhero role-playing game at the time. Massively supported, lots and lots of adventures and supplements for it, several editions. The rules mechanics, the hero system, it became called, designed specifically originally to be a superhero role-playing system, and allows you to do, superheroic things as a sort of a matter of routine, which I think is what you want from a superhero role-playing game. But a good system in its own right. And actually, we were talking about GURPS as a system you could use across different genres. The hero system, as it becomes known, they actually end up publishing that separately and producing a number of other supplements for it, and another number of role-playing games for different genres. So there is Cyber Hero, a cyberpunk, Star Hero, space opera, Ninja Hero, Fantasy Hero, and Fantasy Hero is quite big and successful. A lot of stuff for it continues, and it's still popular. There's definitely still a community playing hero system stuff to this day. We've got quite a lot of champions in stock at the moment, and other hero system material. So link below. Have a look through the shop and see if there's something that takes your fancy. Right, that was it for chapter 5. We're going to do a couple of sidebars next. One called Hank and Hanks. See if you can work out what that's about. And then another one which will tell you all about how Gary Gygax lost control of TSR. After that, we'll come back to the main history, and that'll be time to take us up to 2nd edition AD&D, which is a big change for TSR. Until then, goodbye.